So let's go ahead and break this down into our big checklist. And the first item is the type of light. And this is always the first thing I think about because it sort of puts things in two categories. The first category is direct, bright light. This is like we talked about with the lamp or with, in this case, an outdoor clear day with the sun. And the hallmark of this is a sharp edge. So you have a strong terminator, and then you have sharp cast shadows. Now this would be the opposite. Here we have a very overcast day, which is quite obvious because you can see the sky. And so let's take a closer look at what we're seeing here. The underside of that large rock is darker than the other faces that you can see. So it's not to say there's no lighting information at all, but there's definitely no cast shadows that you can see anywhere. And if you could see some, they'd be very, very soft. And the general effect is that it's all very flat. This has sort of a graphic flattening quality. It gives everything sort of an averaged look. So looking at those two categories, what would you say this one is? Well, the answer would be this is directional light. Although the light in this case is very low in the sky, sort of like a sunset or a sunrise. But the reason you can tell that it is hard directional light, first is because the sky is clear. And the second thing to look for are these rocks in the foreground. You can see that they have very graphic light and dark. And the shapes are broken up in such a way where it's a little hard to tell what the terminators look like. But rest assured, if you see such high contrast in one area, it generally means that you have strong visible light and then a very stark shadow shape. Although it is worth noticing, this hill in the middle ground is lower contrast. Well, the reason for this is this whole thing is in shadow. The light is coming from the left side of the frame, and this entire shadow area is really only separated in values because of the snow versus the rocks. If you look at any of the individual rocks, they're actually very low contrast. Okay, so in this one we can't see the sky, but we know what the sky looks like just because of the shadows. Here you have essentially no shadow shape anywhere. It's all very flat, and the cast shadows are barely visible at all. They're just little soft feathered shadows underneath these bike tires. Same exact deal here. In this case, we can't see the sky, and we can't really see too many reflective surfaces, and yet we know that it is very overcast or very cloudy because there's really no cast shadows on these characters. So once again, it gives a very flat read, and the value instead is coming from the local value of the object. But we'll get to that in a second. This is very much the opposite. This is another low angle light situation, and it just gives these nice, beautiful cast shadows. So there's not a whole lot of information from a color standpoint here. It's a white wall, and the tree is about the same value, but you're getting such a nice pattern of light and dark just from that strong directional light. Now in this one, there's not a whole lot of visible cast shadows, so you might be confused about what it is you're looking at. But the trick in this one is looking at the sand themselves. The little tiny dunes in the sand and little footprints are pretty high contrast, especially when you compare it to this next one here, which I would say the sand is about the same, but you can see they have a very different look. In one case here, the sand is high contrast and you can see those peaks and valleys. And here, it's almost a completely flat tone. So what you're seeing there is little form shadows being cast by strong directional light. So here it's probably sunset, and you're seeing that stark value contrast from the lights and shadows. Whereas here you're really only seeing the local value because it's so cloudy. You're getting very uniform lighting in this sort of a setup. And then a scene like this is going to mix both. So down in the lower part of the composition, the sun is not really able to touch the street because it's probably a pretty low angle sun, and also these are just very tall buildings. So you get a bit of both worlds. Down below, it's all reflected light, and reflected light leads to sort of soft, diffuse shadows. But then up top, you can see there's a strong divide between light and dark, and that's because the tops of the buildings are getting hit by that strong directional light. So you don't always have one or the other. When you look at a piece of reference, it's important to look for the types of shadows and also the contrast between the illuminated form and the shadow shape. And those will tell you essentially what it is you're looking at. So here in our 3D render example, you can see there's a very obvious difference between soft, overcast light or strong directional light. So when you go to make an illustration, it's important that your reference matches your intent. If I was setting out to make an indoor scene with very soft lighting, I would not want to find reference that had very strong directional light. They just have a very different result, as you can tell, so picking the right one is very important. Now, if you're in an outdoor environment, the next thing to consider is whether or not the space is large enough that you're getting atmospheric perspective. And that's what you're looking at here. The lighting is constant across this image. You can see there's no clouds in the sky. Yet in the background, it's much lower contrast than it is in the foreground. And what you're seeing here is just stuff in the air, literally floating particles. Whether it's moisture or dust or pollution, the more of it there is between you and the faraway mountains, the more it is going to affect the end result. So here you get a lower contrast look because there's stuff between you and what you're looking at. And of course, there's less of that stuff between you and the foreground than there is between you and the background. So here's another example. It is very obvious. You have sort of a gradation of contrast from very high contrast in the foreground, looking at those stark cast shadows, to lower and lower contrast as you get further away. And this is a great technique to imply space in an outdoor environment. This one here is another great example because you have such visible light and shadow in the foreground. It's obviously a very clear day, and yet the further away you get into the background, the lower the contrast is. So it might appear hazy back there, as if it's a sort of an indirect cloudy day environment, but it's not. It's just as sunny over there. It's just there's stuff in the air between you and the background. I like this example because it's showing two different things. First, it's showing atmospheric perspective, which we looked at. The background mountain is lower contrast than the foreground. But then there's also this shadowed foreground area. And what you're seeing here is actually entirely shadow shape. The reason you can see details is because there's bounce light filling it back in. But everything below this line is actually totally in shadow. And so within this little bit of the composition, it's as if it was a very cloudy day. You get very soft shadows within the larger shadow. And the same exact deal goes for this one. The middle ground of the composition we're seeing here is all in shadow. You're getting both atmospheric perspective as it recedes into space, but you're also getting lower contrast details within this big shadow. You can see here in the middle ground, there is sun directly hitting the field, and that's resulting in a higher contrast area. But this larger form is actually totally in shadow, and that's going to affect the value arrangement. Now here's a couple quick aerial ones to show what this looks like in different types of weather. Here we have a very clear day, and so you can see a pretty long way. This, however, is a pretty similar angle, and yet there's a lot more atmosphere. And that just is going to vary based on whatever the situation is. If you're somewhere with a lot of pollution, there's going to be more atmospheric perspective. So you can either use that for the sake of realism, or you can enhance the atmospheric perspective for the sake of your illustration. Because again, you're going for a clear read, so sometimes it just comes down to artistic choices and not strict realism. So here in this illustration context, I've copied the main sphere, but obviously it doesn't look quite right. So the way I'd approach this would just be to use the levels command to alter the values. So in this case, I want to shrink down the range of values while retaining the value curve. So I'm going to keep this top one here in the center. You can see I'm modifying the background sphere. And the closer I move these two arrows together, the lower the overall contrast is. So it's going to sort of visually recede into space. And then I'll do a little bit less of that effect for the one in the midground. And now you can see that the three really fit into the space better. They still have strong cast shadows, they still have strong terminators, but the overall value range is changed. And that helps them sort of recede into space. If I did the same exact experiment with an overcast day like this, I might even be a little more heavy-handed about it. Because a day like this is just going to have more haze, which means it's going to have more atmospheric perspective. So I'll start with the midground one this time. And I'm going to lower the contrast. And then I'm going to be very heavy-handed with that one in the faraway background. I'm going to drop that down almost to a solid tone. And it works. In this case, it looks like it's falling back into that sort of fog or just general haziness that the day has. Okay, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and try out a few more properties.